We are coming up on the 70th anniversary of the UN General Assembly recommended partition plan from November 29th of 1947. This map over here shows, again, a division of what would be an Arab state and a Jewish state. And the majority of the land is given over to a potential Palestinian Arab state. The Jews again accepted the partition plan. The Arabs again have rejected that plan, and that's when five armies attacked the nation state of Israel, which was declared in May of 1948, and Israel defeated the five Arab armies and obtained greater lands in this defensive battle. As this map shows you right here in 1949, the approved armistice agreement. Now what you see here in the green area is known by some as the West Bank, that was renamed as an area by Jordan in 1950 to disassociate its connection with the Jewish people. In fact, that area has always been known as Judea and Samaria, and in fact in the partition plan documents in the UN in 1947, it refers to that area as the hill country of Judea, because that's what it was known as. But people call it today the West Bank, and that is a misnomer. But you can see here on this map that the Arabs were pushed back further, and had they accepted the partition plan, they would have had greater area. The British severely limited Jewish immigration into Palestine, virtually shutting off the only escape route to millions of Jews who were being slaughtered by Hitler and the Nazis during the Holocaust. This was unforgivable and a terrible betrayal of the British mandate for Palestine. So, what is the further significance of Balfour? The answer is that while Balfour Declaration didn't change the world, I would argue that it changed the Jews. Because after 1800 years of dispersion and hopelessness, here was the British Empire saying that the time had come for the Jews to reconstitute themselves as a free nation in their land. Suddenly, Balfour made it practically possible to achieve the goal of a national liberation. And under the League of Nations mandate, the Jews were given an international charter for the reconstitution of their national homeland. Just as important, the Balfour Declaration ignited the imagination and passion of Jews throughout the world. For the first time since the fall of Pt2, Jews dispersed throughout the nations dared to believe that the reconstitution of Israel could happen in their lifetime. Of course, for the 6 million Jews in Europe, it was not realized in time. But here too the Balfour Declaration was significant. The legitimacy of the Declaration conferred on Zionism in the eyes of world Jewry gave the Jews an answer to Hitler. As the Nazis rose to power, for the first time the Jews knew what they needed to do, and for the first time the majority of world Jewry embraced Zionism. Israel's first Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion famously once said, "It doesn't matter what the Gentiles say, it matters what the Jews do." The statement might be considered harsh by some, but it is accurate and prescient. And by and large, generally speaking, the nations of the world have not supported the Jews, nor the diaspora, not in the diaspora, nor the state of Israel itself. All to their peril, I would argue, as some Christian Zionists and others who believe in the words of the Bible. God blesses those who blesses the Jewish people in Israel and curses those who curses Israel. So it's a mixed bag on the legacy of Balfour. Now the critics in the left actually were pro-Zionist back in the day. And I say back in the day meaning 100 years ago. So what happened? There are several historical events that all catalyzed its evolution away from its pro-Zionist initial stance. The first one is the Cold War, and in particular this marked the turning point at which the left began to fall out of love and out of favor with Israel's kibbutznik idealism and pesky insistence on self-defense. The second factor was the collapse of the British Empire itself after World War II. The hysterical attitude towards colonialism has become the essence of the essential stance of the left itself. Thus, the self-liberation movements of the Jews reimagined as an exercise in colonialism. Never mind that this description did not quite fit. However, how can you colonialize your own ancestral home? But never mind that the young Jews in pre-Israel Palestine were committed socialists, internationalists who walked around with copies of For Whom the Bell Tolls in their pockets. But, in fact, the third, and I would claim probably the most significant reason why the left does not care for the Jewish state is envy and jealousy. One dare not speak of this. It is all very well when Jews were obviously powerless, but now that they have made an economic and military success of their country, the oldest prejudice is creeping back, and depressingly enough, it has been allowed to gain a stranglehold on the left. The British government has been asked, interestingly enough, but probably not surprisingly, by the Arabs over the past year to reject the Balfour Declaration and to apologize. Her Majesty's government, however, in April 2017 issued a statement that the Balfour Declaration is an historic statement for which Her Majesty's government does not intend to apologize. Quote, "We are proud of our role in creating the State of Israel. The Declaration was written in a world of competing imperial powers in the midst of the First World War and the twilight of the Ottoman Empire. In that context, establishing a homeland for the Jewish people in the land to which they had such strong historical and religious ties was the right and moral thing to do, particularly against the background of centuries of persecution." More recently, UK Prime Minister Theresa May told the House of Commons that, quote, "We are proud of our role that we played in the creation of the State of Israel, and we will certainly mark the centenary of the Balfour Declaration with pride." And certainly she did, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu did visit Great Britain for a very significant commemoration of that particular date. Quote, "We must also be conscious of the sensitivities that some people do have about the Balfour Declaration, and we recognize that there is more work to be done." Certainly there is, on all sides as well. Balfour can explain why the peace process has failed generally. The problem the Palestinian Arabs have with Israel is its existence, not its settlements, or occupied territory, or the security barrier. After Balfour, subsequent British governments not only whittled down the size of the Jewish home, but also betrayed their promise by limiting the rights of Jews in order to appease the Arab and Muslim world. That led to a series of proposals for further dividing the land, but the Arabs have refused every single offer, including the UN partition plan of 1947. Of course, had they accepted that, they would be celebrating their 70th anniversary, just like the State of Israel will be in May of 2018. Sharing even part of the country to the Arabs is unthinkable. The Balfour Declaration is also important because it recognizes the historical bond of the Jewish people to the Holy Land, a bond which existed long before the Declaration. What is significant is that its public and formal recognition is its incorporation into international law. In his testimony before the Peel Commission I mentioned earlier in 1937, David Ben-Gurion stated, "I say on behalf of the Jews that the Bible is our mandate. The Bible, which was written by us in our own language, in Hebrew, in this very country, that is our mandate. It is only recognition of this right which was expressed in the Balfour Declaration." Thus, I would say, the British Mandate and the Balfour Declaration upon which it was based did not create Jewish historical rights, but rather recognize pre-existing rights. Israel's enemies seek to misrepresent and falsify the historical record. They try to portray modern Israel as a product of European colonialism with no roots in the land and no historical rights. Modern Israel, however, is the heir and successor to ancient Israel. The Balfour Declaration recognized this bond. I also believe that today there's a genuine excitement among Christian supporters of Israel, the people of the Hebrew Bible, who are walking again in the footsteps of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Judah the Maccabee. To have freedom of religion and walk where Jesus walked inspires these supporters. Whatever Lord Balfour's motives, his actions enabled Jews to enter the family of nations and return to build up and grow Israel as it is the marvel that it is today. As I said, the Balfour Declaration didn't change the world, it changed the Jewish world. It didn't change the Jewish world by creating a state for us, it changed the Jewish world by helping us to believe that we could fulfill our longing to return to Zionism. And once we believed it, we did it. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the Knesset recently to mark the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. Quote, "When the Palestinian leadership defined the Balfour Declaration as a crime, when they call on the British government to apologize for it, they are going back 100 years. And that is the root of the conflict, the 100-year refusal to recognize Zionism, to recognize the Jewish national home in the land of Israel, to recognize the state of Israel within any borders. The tragedy of the Balfour Declaration is that it took 30 years to implement it. We are tightening our relations with the moderate elements in the region, establishing peace with Egypt and Jordan. We are acting to achieve peace with other Arab countries who stand with us in the face of radical Islam, and I can only hope that the Palestinians finally adopt this approach and turn to peace." If anything, the breach of the Balfour Declaration was against Israel. Not only was potential Jewish national home reduced in land size by some 3/4, but the delay in its implementation by some 30 years contributed to the oppression, boycott, and then slaughter of virtually all of Europe's Jews, while the leader of the Palestinian Arabs, the Mufti of Jerusalem, offered his support for Hitler. The Arabs have never accepted a state of the Jewish people living side by side next to them, and in fact have rejected a state 6 times since 1937. This is the map of 1967 after Israel successfully won the Six-Day War, and it incorporates, as you can see, the entire Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and all of Jerusalem. Israel ultimately offered to give back that territory, and it did, and in establishing a peace treaty with Egypt, and the Sinai was returned in 1982. This is another important map that shows you that Israel is situated in a very difficult and hostile neighborhood. These are the 20 Arab League nations that surround tiny Israel, all basically through North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And here's even a bigger map if you pull back. The tiny Israel, that little red area, is surrounded by green countries. These are basically the 56 Muslim-dominated countries that exist and are a large block of the United Nations. Israel is that tiny little oasis that is surrounded in there. And you can see how small Israel really is in relation to these countries. It's basically the size of New Jersey, with very, very tight borders. In fact, only 9 miles wide at its narrowest from the area of the western portion of Judea and Samaria to the Mediterranean is only 9 miles wide. And just a little geography for those of you who are not familiar or need a refresher. As this slide shows you, Israel has only a 112-mile coastline, 260 miles at its longest, 60 miles depth at its widest, 3 to 9 miles at its narrowest, and only 8,000 square miles, about the size of the state of New Jersey. Again, tiny, 1/19th the size of California. And it fits into the United States 768 times. It is 1/625th, which is 1/6 of 1% of the Arab world in size. And if you count Iran, which is not an Arab country, that ratio is 650 to 1. And Israel, as I mentioned, is surrounded by 22 hostile Arab Muslim states. 1.6 billion Muslims in the world compared to 6.8 million Jews who live in Israel. The regional population ratio is 56 to 1. There are 1.8 million Arabs who live in Israel as full citizens, and there are only 14 million Jews in the world today, about 5 million less than there were in 1939 before the Holocaust. That is David versus the Goliath that Israel is facing. Israel is a small nation, and how it makes a great difference. It shares with the world its humanitarianism, the beacon of shared Judeo-Christian values. It is an open democracy. It respects the civil rights, minority rights, gay rights, the independent, robust, free judiciary, and is an asset and ally of the United States, and an oasis in the hostile totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and theological dominion in the Islamic desert. It shares with the world. It tries to embody the spirit of tikkun olam, which translates to repairing the world, making the world better. And I like to always end on a very important note. Here's a t-shirt which I have found. It says, civilizations, nations, and empires that have tried to destroy the Jewish people. And it has the columns of the nations. Ancient Egypt, status gone. Philistines, Assyrians, Empire, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantine, Crusaders, Spanish, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, Hamas, and possibly Iran. Those all gone except for the last two. They are in progress. God bless the IDF, the Jewish people, the smallest of nations, but with a friend in the highest of places, so be nice. Finally, I would say that the Jews of Israel are essentially saying, thank you very much, Lord Balfour. We'll take it from here.